Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Fossil Creek Nursery class here. My name is Hunter. I'm going to be helping you out today. So today we're going to go into a little bit of plant pathology. Woo! Fun stuff, right? So we're going to talk about fungal diseases, going to talk about bacterial diseases, and then a little bit about viruses, and in between we'll talk about a couple products that you can use. Cool. So I'm just going to dive right into it then. We'll start with fungal diseases. Fungal diseases are going to be a little more easier to take care of, so we'll start with the easy stuff. Um, Fungal diseases usually show themselves by mycelium of the fungus itself. You'll see things like powdery mildew has the white type of fungus, and like the name says, it almost looks powdery. Then there's other things like downy mildew that shows itself in black spots. And then there's Dutch elm disease, which has actually been around for quite some time. It's something that actually killed off a lot of the elm trees that are on the East Coast. It came here, like the namesake, from the Dutch in the 1800s. So I'm going to go into just a little bit more of a detail on each of those guys. So the Dutch elm disease, we'll start with that one. Um, it's something that transfers tree to tree, and it enters the vascular system and clogs it up. It usually shows itself as a black kind of streaking discoloration of the vascular system. So it's kind of hard to diagnose right off the bat. So the way you want to do it is you'll clip off a few of the smaller twigs, like 1 inch, 2 inch diameter twigs, and kind of peel back the bark a little bit. So if you got your twig here, you're going to kind of just peel back. And if you see that discoloration underneath the bark, that is a tried and true sign of Dutch elm disease. Like the name says, it only affects elm disease, but elm is a popular tree. We carry them here also. So it's something to definitely keep in the back of your mind. There's elms all over Fort Collins. So yeah, common tree for sure. Um, if it's a small infection, the way to deal with it is to essentially just remove it. So the twigs or the smaller branches that have signs of it, you just cut them off, and really dispose of them sanitary because it is easily spread. Another thing to be wary of is to clean up your scissors, clippers, anything like that that's come in contact with it. That's kind of across the board what you want to do with any when you're dealing with any kind of pathogen, pathology, anything like that, like disease, bacterial, fungus, etc. Is you want to have that good cultural practice. If it's gotten to the point where that discoloration has moved itself into the actual trunk of the tree, then that tree needs to be removed. That's because it's so easily spread and such a destructive disease, fungal disease. If it gets beyond control, it needs to be disposed of, which is unfortunate, but in the long run, it'll end up being better for all of us. Going down the list, I've got powdery mildew is our next one. Powdery mildew is really common in garden vegetables and in greenhouses. It shows itself by kind of a white powdery substance on the leaves at first, and then you'll start to see yellowing and kind of orange spots appear in a more severe infection. And what essentially happens is that mycelium is the basis of fungus, sorry. And what happens is that mycelium acts as a base, and then the fungus actually grows down into the actual plant cell and attacks the chlorophyll. And since it attacks the chlorophyll, that's why you see that loss of the green, and you're going to have more yellow spots. And that's just how the chlorophyll basically dying off and becoming anemic. One of the biggest things that promotes powdery mildew is going to be high moisture, overwatering too, overhead watering. So like sprinklers and things like that really promote it. And along with that, lack of airflow. So if plants are planted too close together, if you haven't done a lot of pruning lately, for example, a tomato plant, you want to keep the middle of it pretty open. We're talking about through the main stem out. If there's any growth on that main stem that's small or maybe crossing limbs, things like that, you want to get that out of there. because that lack of airflow is going to promote basically a microclimate that the humidity is going to build up, and then your powdery mildew comes next. Powdery mildew, if you catch it early, is pretty easy to take care of. Something like a copper fungicide spray is really good for powdery mildew, and I've dealt with powdery mildew many times. So this product, it's a organic fertilome product. It's copper soap fungicide. One thing it's great, it's organic, so using it, kind of more often is not going to be bad for the environment or beneficial insects or anything like that. So really good stuff. If you're going to move into powdery mildew in bigger plants, like big shrubs or trees, you're going to want to use a systemic drench. We have that also. It's a fertilome product called Tree and Shrub Drench. It's something you use once a year at the beginning of the year, and done and done. And the good thing about that drench too is it also has controls for insects and also bacterial diseases along with the fungal disease. So kind of getting 3 birds with 1 stone. The next one I'll talk about is downy mildew. Downy mildew specifically attacks cucurbits, which is cucumbers, watermelons, squash. There's many of them. Melons, all kinds of melons, like watermelons. And this shows itself by having dark lesions on the leaf. So unlike powdery mildew, which you're going to see the white, this one is going to have the it's almost a black lesion. Downy mildew can be a little more destructive if not controlled, and it can definitely kill off your plant if it's not taken care of. Same thing, copper fungicide mainly attacks vegetable plants, so you're not going to be having to deal with really using the systemic one. Good stuff. All right, so now something that attacks grass specifically, and this is very common. It's easy to overwater grass or easy to promote the conditions for it, and that's going to be the necrotic ring spot. It's also known as a fairy ring, and as its namesake, it actually forms a proper ring in your grass, which is pretty fascinating, but not good for it. So we don't have this issue here, but lots and lots of rain is what causes it in other parts of the country. Here it's going to be overwatering with sprinklers. It's so dry in Colorado. It's necessary to water often with your grass. So easy to do. But we can fix it. You can see it easily. Like I said, it shows as a ring. If you have drought stress, it's going to be patches of dead. The ring spot is literally going to show itself as a ring. And what stops it is the f-stop. This is also a fungicide that you can use on other plants, but specifically this is the one that we want to use for our necrotic ring spot. And it's a fertilome product. Once again, this is really easy to use. As you can see, this one has the hose attachment. So attach the hose here. This is a nozzle, and you just go and spray. Directions are always on the back of all these products. And yeah, that's necrotic spot. So moving on, we got botrytis, which is also known as gray mold. It usually develops on new wounds of a plant. So if you're doing a lot of pruning, if you've got some kind of wind damage, broken stems, things like that is where botrytis is going to show itself. Lack of airflow in those inner parts of your vegetables I was talking about when you're pruning is going to promote botrytis. So kind of the overall theme of fungus is too much water, high humidity, and lack of airflow. That's the big key cultural practices to make sure you prevent these infections. And botrytis also, copper soap fungicide. And then our last fungal infection that we'll talk about is cankers. There are tons and tons of different cankers, so I'm going to kind of go a little bit more general with it. Some places that you see a lot of cankering is peach trees, so this goes for the western slope. Very common, and especially with things like apples or peaches, high moisture fruits are what tend to get the canker the most. It happens when plants are just barely stressed out. It can happen very easily, and it attacks it pretty quickly. It can girdle the tree, which essentially cuts the vascular system off, which in turn will completely kill the tree. They appear as a resinous sore, kind of like a callus on the plant, and it looks pretty nasty too. It's easy to identify because it is almost like an open wound that has the resin of the tree coming out. You'll get once it gets onto its life cycle, you'll start to see the black fruiting bodies, which is going to be what is releasing the spore and the actual proper fungus showing. And way to prevent that, copper fungicide is another one. If we're talking about the peach trees and stuff, you're going to want to use drenches. A lot of times when canker develops is when fruiting bodies first show themselves, the fruiting bodies, excuse me, of the trees first show themselves. So when you're getting the flowers that are just turning into fruit, that's when the most moisture is around the leaves, around the trunk, all that. That is what promotes it. Yeah, and that's fungal. So we'll do a little bacterial diseases, starting with fire blight. So fire blight affects a wide variety of plants. It can affect the rose family, apples, pears, quince, and crab apples, so all the malus family, the apples. It will kill the plant. It is very, very dangerous to plant life. It'll kill the branches off, start dropping branches, and eventually head to the whole tree. It shows itself, the blossoms, flower blossoms will look like they're soaked with water, and it discolors the leaves and bark. It'll leave brown, leading into black spots on the bark. It can be transferred by insects, also unsanitary tools, so not cleaning your tools after you may have pruned a apple and then you're going over to prune a rose. The bacteria will actually get onto that scissor, onto that pruner, and transfer over. So it's very important. Using isopropyl alcohol will get rid of it easy, just like that. And it's hard to control. So there's a critical time period when you're going to want to use a fire blight control, and that is when blossoms are first appearing. There can be some really toxic stuff that prevents fire blight, but what we have is streptomycin, which is actually an antibiotic that is not very used very often anymore, but can be used by humans for bacterial infections. But it's a bacteria that will kill all bacteria, so it will end up hurting the beneficial bacteria in you. But anyways, I digress. So fire blight spray, this is a little powder mixture that you will put into a spray bottle. It is the streptomycin. It's kind of hard to see with little wording there. And so, like I said, with fire blight, it's very crucial to do it at a certain time. If you do it later in the season when it's not blooming, it's going to do absolutely nothing. So very important to keep that in mind. And then another kind of lilac blight, or another kind of blight, is going to be the lilac blight. Specifically, as the namesake says, it's going to affect lilacs. And the best way to identify this is checking out the new buds. So the new buds that haven't quite flowered yet will appear blackish. That's the first biggest sign of it. In cool, wet, rainy weather is when it shows the worst. Obviously, we don't have that in Colorado. We're about the exact opposite. But what can affect it with us is overhead watering, so heavy sprinkler usage, and then lack of airflow. Lack of airflow kind of shows up in all of this. So cultural practices are very important when it's coming to doing your gardening. This one, there's not a lot to do to control it, so the best way to avoid it is to use fire blight resistant species of lilacs. There is a large list of them, so I'm not going to go down the list, but there's quite a few of them. And one thing that I actually found today that can lead to lilac blight also, which is kind of interesting, is over fertilizing late season lilacs. So you're going to want to fertilize lilacs kind of early in the season because lilacs are going to bloom pretty early. So if you add a lot of fertilizer to the plant, say in September, when there's not a lot of growth going on, that extra nitrogen that's in the plant will actually feed the bacteria and cause it to be more vigorous. Another thing that will do it is overwater or over fertilizing very young plants. So if you've got something that you may have just planted or something you started from seed per se, you're not going to want to hit that with a lot of fertilizer. Moving on. So yeah, as far as bacterial infections, those are kind of the big ones. There's, of course, many bacterial infections, but in Colorado, there's not as many that are super important to know, really. And that's because, like I said, with some of them, they are coming up in soak conditions, rainy, cloudy for extended periods of time, and obviously we don't really have that. So yeah, so bacterial viruses or bacterial infections, something to be aware of, but not as common as a fungal bacteria. The last one we're going to talk about is viruses. So viruses, they're hard to diagnose. Viruses have about 12 or more different signs from you can have mottling, which is basically the plant is shriveling up, or mosaics, which is almost kind of looks like a rust spot. Mosaics are, for example, there's tobacco mosaic virus, something that affects tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, and then tobacco also shows up like a mosaic, but it can also show up as leaf curling, which is a sign of many different issues. Leaf curling can come from herbicide damage all the way to aphids, all the way to fungal infections. So it's a very broad ranged type of symptom to diagnose. Distorted leaf, kind of the same. So as you can see, the signs for bacteria or viruses are very similar to that of bacteria and fungus. Insects are the main vectors, but also the unsanitary tools is going to be one that is going to transfer that. And besides, I said the tobacco mosaic virus, but there's also rose mosaic, which will show up as the rust spot at first. It's very slowly acting, kind of slow death for the plant. So it's hard to really diagnose and get rid of it immediately. Peony ring spot's another one, and it's going to kind of show up similar to the tobacco mosaic also. And yeah, that kind of goes through the most common things you will see as far as plant pathology goes. So I'll just take a second and answer a few questions if anybody's got them. All right, y'all. Thanks for tuning in. My name's Hunter again, and we'll see you next time.